Hi, and welcome to the CBC's Washington Bureau. I'm here with Keith Boag, one of our senior correspondents, and today we're going to be taking your questions. Keith will be answering them, and the topic we're going to discuss is a lengthy column that he wrote that was posted on CBC.ca yesterday, which really explored one of the key things in the U.S. election campaign, and that is the racial anxiety that has been turned up by the Donald Trump campaign. And so if you have any questions, please go to Facebook and start sending them our way. But I want to start, Keith, with approaching the whole topic of race, right? Because a year ago, when we were thinking about this, you approached the subject with some trepidation, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I wanted to do a story on Donald Trump because I thought the phenomenon was a fascinating one. This was in August of last year. And frankly, I wanted to get to it in a hurry because I wasn't sure Donald Trump was going to be around all that long in the presidential race, because like everyone else who covers politics for a living, we got it wrong, completely wrong. But in doing so, I was looking at what was driving the vote that was coming out for Donald Trump, that was turning around his polls. And there seemed to be a number of possibilities. One was the economic anxiety that people were feeling after the recession of 2008 and a long, prolonged period of transfer of jobs out of the country, a transfer of wealth to the 1% and all those kinds of things. But at the same time, there were clear signals from Donald Trump that he was pressing buttons that activated the racial anxiety of Americans, particularly when he launched his campaign, as everyone remembers, and he talked about Mexicans as rapists and bringing drugs into the country and so on. And I was wondering what the balance between those two things was. And then at about the same time, I learned that he was getting support from neo-Nazi groups, white nationalist groups, white supremacist groups, and I thought that was interesting. But the trepidation that I had in deciding to do with the story, which is what you're referring to, was how much emphasis should I place on those elements versus the others, versus the economic anxiety. And so we had long discussions about that with friends of mine whose opinion I respect, with my producer, Marie Claudette. At one point we had set up some interviews with a white nationalist group in Cincinnati, Ohio, who was very supportive of Trump, and then pulled it down because I just wasn't confident that that was really the story to tell at that time. We brought it back up again and decided, let's see what we get first. And what we got, I thought, was very interesting. This white nationalist group called the Traditionalist Worker Party was quite enthusiastic about what Trump was saying, didn't really care whether he became president because they were traditionally disengaged from mainstream politics. But what they liked about it was that Donald Trump was changing the conversation in America, making race an issue in America, making the identity issue an issue in America, making what it is to be an American an issue in America, and they were very enthusiastic about that. I wanted to balance it off with what I considered to be a more ordinary Trump supporter, someone who represented the demographic of the older white male who polling was showing was where Trump was finding his strongest support, but who wasn't associated with fringe groups in the alt-right. And we found
That's Ed Hunter.
That's Ed Hunter. We found Ed Hunter. My producer, Marie Claudette, found him at a demonstration on Capitol Hill against the Iran nuclear deal. And he just happened to be the guy with the biggest sign, so he attracted Marie's attention. But then when she talked to him, he just sounded really interesting. He was funny. He was thoughtful. He was comfortable on TV. So we went to meet him. And that was really the beginning of a year-long relationship between myself and Ed Hunter. We did a piece with him in which I think he articulated very well some of the concerns of his of that demographic of people who had felt that the country was heading in the wrong direction. The economy didn't work for them anymore, and they were concerned about the changing face of America, which is a way of expressing racial anxiety for many people. So our conversation continued for over a year, and I found him to be one of the most insightful people into what was driving Donald Trump's support to this day that I have talked to. Some of it got really, really close in terms of him talking about race. I wasn't always comfortable with the things that I was getting from him, but they were always honest, they were always thoughtful, and so the conversation continued. And I guess the piece that I wrote has the provocative title, Make America White Again, which obviously is a play on Donald Trump's campaign slogan, Make America Great Again. It's provocative. It was meant to be. We wanted you to read it and to see what you thought. I hope nobody just read the title and moved on and made a judgment about that, but we'll see.
We have a first question here. It's from Alex Milne, and he's talking about Donald Trump, and he says that the harder Donald Trump tries to sabotage his own campaign, which a lot of people have talked about that being a possibility, the more successful he is. And he's wondering what that tells us about voters in America.
Well, I think there are two separate kinds of campaigns in which to analyze that question, Alex. It's certainly true that during the primary campaign, there seemed to be nothing that Donald Trump could say that would hurt him. People thought that when he said that, Mexicans are rapists coming into the country, they're drug dealers, that was so far off the page in terms of mainstream politics that he essentially ended his campaign before it began. But of course, we now know different. The same thing was said when he talked about a Muslim ban after the San Bernardino shootings. That was said to be the end of his campaign. It had gone beyond the pale, but it wasn't. He was clearly understanding a certain part of America way, way better than the people who pride themselves professionally in being able to do that. But I think the mistakes that he has made in the general election campaign, which let's say began when it became clear that Donald Trump was going to be the nominee. So that's kind of an arbitrary date that predates the conventions, predates Labor Day.
Indiana, so May.
Yeah, maybe Indiana was a primary that seemed to be decisive and drove Ted Cruz out of the race. From that point on, I think that the coverage changed on him a little bit, and maybe the polling began to reflect a little bit more some of the polarizing things that are clearly an element of Donald Trump's campaign as well. I think we are seeing him hurt himself by things that he says in the campaign now. And I think that some of the things that others say about him have begun to hurt him as well. I mean, the polls are tightening now. I think we have to be candid about that. They're tighter than they were coming out of the conventions. So something is going on that has improved marginally his status or has detracted from the Hillary Clinton support. In any event, they are coming together. And in conjunction with that, I do think we're seeing at least a slightly different Donald Trump out on the campaign trail now. And that may also be an explanation for why he may have staunched the bleeding, as some people put it.
Here's a question from Barry Sharp, which really goes to the context in which this election is happening. And he wants to know about President Obama specifically. He says that Obama has divided America more than anyone could have done. That statement's come from a lot of people who think that he hasn't reached enough out to Congress, that his style is such that it's kind of a my way or the highway sort of way of looking at things. What do you think about that? Do you think that really set the context for what we're seeing right now?
I think, Barry, it's an important question to discuss, but I would phrase it differently. I think Obama's presidency has divided the country in ways that were unforeseen in 2008 when it was all hosannas and isn't this great, and we're into an era of post-racial politics. I don't think it's fair to blame Barack Obama from that when you have so many people reacting against his presidency just on the face of it. At the top of that list is Donald Trump. What other president can we recall who had his birthright questioned, who had his religious faith questioned, just as a matter of course? I don't think that we can deny that revealed something. The people who agreed with that, without any evidence to support it, and with a ton of evidence to contradict it, nevertheless, people believed it, and you have to ask yourself why. I think it was something that we recognized at the 2012, the midpoint in Obama's presidency election, that race relations were worse because of Barack Obama's presidency in many, many ways. But whether that's his fault for being a black man, I don't think that covers it really.
Chris Butler just asked us a question, and he wants to know if Trump's sensationalist campaign can actually be beat. You said those numbers are tightening. She's still ahead, though. She has the clearest path to the presidency.
Yeah, I mean, she has the clearest path to the presidency, and I think that there are mistakes that can be made by looking at the election only through the lens of polling. And that's because of the Electoral College, which complicates all of these things. It's not good enough to win nationally in public opinion polls. You have to win in a collection of states that earns you 270 or more electoral votes to become the president. So I think the chances of Hillary Clinton winning the election, stopping Donald Trump, if you want to put it that way, are actually far greater than the sort of 2-point margin or 2.5-point margin that she would have. And I think the Real Clear Politics polling average is at 2.5 today. But something like the 538 website, which actually has a model for trying to calculate the chances of winning the White House and incorporates not just national polling and state polling, but where it happens, where the support is, and how that affects the Electoral College vote, has Hillary Clinton at about a 70% chance of becoming the next president and Donald Trump around 30%. So her chances of becoming president are roughly 2.5 times better than his. So I think, is that enough of an answer? I'm happy to talk about that more, but I don't want to drive it down into a rabbit hole.
Yeah, I think that the polls sort of agree in that area, but that, of course, is barring something we haven't thought about yet.
Yeah, I mean, there's this thing called the October surprise, which can be anything you can possibly imagine happening out of the blue to have an impact on how people see their choices in the election. And, you know, that could happen. People often refer to the possibility of another 9/11 type attack that really has a powerful impact on flipping people's voting intentions. That could happen. You know, there's a reason they play the games, they say, in sports, and there's a reason they have the vote in politics, because, you know, you have to see it play itself out to know what the final answer is. I want to say something else just to get back to the 538 analysis. There is a tendency, and I think they talked about this on 538 in one of their politics podcasts recently, to look at the 70% chance of Hillary Clinton winning the election and round that up to 100% because it's such a big number. The better way to look at it is that the model doesn't work if Donald Trump doesn't win 30% of the time. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things they did that was useful was to liken it to a basketball player at the free throw line. You know, he's a basketball star. The game is on the line, maybe the championship of the world, right? And you know, he can miss sometimes because he does miss sometimes. That's how you should feel about this election. If you want to consider what the chances are, there's a chance Donald Trump can win it, and don't let anybody tell you different.
And this is what's so good about a forum like Facebook, is we get to respond directly to some of the things you think about some of the things that we do, which is important. And a few of you are asking questions saying that they believe our coverage to have been a little bit leaning to the left. Specifically, Gilbert James says, can the media be trusted when it focuses on the ills of one candidate only? And this is a tough one, right?
Well, I think it's one of the most interesting questions of this campaign, and I think it's a very fair point. And people describe it differently. I mean, you know, Jay Rosen, who teaches at Columbia University, has written a lot about this and who tweets a lot about it, and I urge you to follow him. And whether you agree with him or disagree with him, at least get engaged in his debate. And what he's interested in is how the media is covering an election campaign that is clearly asymmetrical. What he means by that is you have, you know, Hillary Clinton with her issues on one side, which are, you know, they can be for you whatever you want. They can be, you know, the Benghazi, the email scandal, whatever, just the length of time she's been around and the fact that people don't like her husband maybe that much, whatever you want. That's her basket of negative baggage, right?
And it's legitimate.
And it's all legitimate. But I mean, the baggage that Donald Trump is carrying into this that doesn't even get looked at is way, way bigger. And journalists have a hard time on, you know, figuring out how to cover an asymmetrical campaign when most of our training has been to try to be even-handed about both sides. I think a lot is going to be written about the coverage of this and about the difficulty of that issue in particular, but it was on display when we saw the Commander-in-Chief Forum on NBC this week, and Matt Lauer was roundly criticized for being harder on Hillary Clinton than he was on Donald Trump. But one of the explanations for that was, you know, it's so easy to be hard on Donald Trump that you kind of want to overcompensate and be like really hard to balance it out on Hillary Clinton and spend like half the time on the email issue. And then when Donald Trump says something that is untrue, such as I was always against the Iraq War, just let it go, so that somehow at the end of the day, it all comes out in the wash. I don't know that that's a good way to do journalism at all.
A question here from Billy Burgess, and he says that either right or wrong, win or lose, he believes America will be on the verge of a civil war. His question is, how will the nation recover from this election, and how would that impact Canada? Should we be worried? What happens to these Trump voters, even if he loses? They're still in the mix, right?
Yeah, I think that's a hugely important thing. what Donald Trump has done is awaken something in America that was simmering below the surface. He's given it agency. He's changed the conversation and eliminated all of the political correctness from it, and that has emboldened people to say things that can be destructive to the national conversation in America. Now, I know there are a lot of people who think that is a good thing. And there are parts about it that certainly are a good thing, because just the recognition that not everybody in the country feels that they have been paid attention to, I think, is an important lesson. But what happens to those voters after November 8th, in particular if Donald Trump loses? They are still out there. What will their attitude be towards the Republican Party? They have been empowered by the experience and emboldened by the experience of the last year to know that they cannot be ignored. I think that's an issue for the Republican Party to figure out how it's going to deal with that. But the reality of America is different, looks different now from how it looked a year ago, and that's not going away November 8th. That's what people are going to have to deal with. How it affects Canada, I mean, I think it affects Canada very differently depending on who wins the election. But I think that Canada may, politicians in Canada may want to look very closely at the kinds of things we've seen in American politics over the past year, and see, whether there is application for those lessons in Canada, whether there is the sense of alienation from the process in Canada that exists obviously in America today, whether that's something they need to pay attention to before they lose control of it, or whether they think they can just whistle their way past the graveyard. I don't think they will. I think they're, if I can figure it out, so can they.
But you'd be naive to think that that doesn't exist in Canada.
Naive to think that it doesn't exist in Canada, yeah.
John Leopold, I believe I'm saying that right, John, has put a question here about how religion plays into all of this, because I don't know that that's something Canadians are as used to in the forefront of political discourse. He wants to know that why Republicans appear to believe that in order to be president, he says you have to be a good white Christian. So why is that? And is that the case?
Well, I think Barack Obama proved that you don't have to be white. But I don't see that anybody has been up there that can prove that you don't have to be religious. I think that really is a line that you cannot cross in American politics. Religion is a much more important thing in American political life than it is in Canadian political life. I think that it can be important in Canadian personal life, but we don't really experience that much in our political life in Canada at all. It's fundamental in American politics. For better and for worse. I mean, I had a really interesting email exchange about my piece last night over email, where another Canadian who had been in the United States was remarking about how much more religious people are here, but also how they have a much more generous sense of community, volunteerism, the role of the church in the community than we have in Canada, and in a very positive way. So, I think we should be respectful of that. But am I getting too far off the track?
No, I don't think so. I think that is, it is one of the things that is a striking difference between
I mean, one thing you hear people say from time to time is that, we've had an African American president in the United States. We'll have a woman, we'll have a gay person, we'll have an Hispanic, we'll have all of those things long before we see an atheist in the White House. So, I mean, probably we've seen an atheist in the White House.
They just couldn't say it publicly.
You can't do that publicly.
Yeah. We have some questions about looking broader to the Hillary Clinton campaign. A couple people are wondering what your thoughts are on how she is doing to this point and what strikes you from that side of things.
Well, I mean, how's she doing? I mean, she's doing, I think, surprisingly well, because she's got a tough task. Whether you want to call it the third term of Obama or just the difficulty of an incumbent party seeking re-election, I mean, that is the gamble that she's made. That the American people are not tired of a Democrat in the White House and are ready for a woman. I mean, those are two gambles, and I think that the polls are reflecting that she's okay in that. Now, it may be a reflection of the fact that she's running against Donald Trump. I mean, as I say in my piece, it may turn out that at the end of this, people decide that this election was an election for Republicans to lose, and Donald Trump showed them how to do it. If it turns out that way, we'll hear about that. But I think that the fact that she is where she is in the polls, in spite of all of the things that have happened over the course of the campaign, the challenge from Bernie Sanders, the fact that she is extremely an insider as opposed to someone who's extremely an outsider.
And a dynasty
that's a contrast.
candidate.
And a dynasty candidate, that's a good point. I think all of that makes it surprising. But, look at where we are right now, and it does seem to be happening.
Another question from, again, I hope I'm saying this correctly. This is Jinji Segulam Singh Henderson, and she's looking ahead. She, or he, I'm unclear. Do you think there will be a new alternative to the Republican Party emerge after this election? Will the Republican Party survive?
No. I don't think anybody thinks the Republican Party is going to survive this in the sense that it's going to go back to being the party of, Mitt Romney or the Bush family or Ronald Reagan or, this is really a watershed moment for the Republican Party. I heard some young Republican women on television about a month ago talking about the tremendous opportunity that this presents for them. And their point was that they felt that they were gradually insinuating themselves into the hierarchy of power into the Republican Party, but that it was a tough place to find a room in that house. And then suddenly someone has come and burned the house down, and they have to start again to rebuild it, but they are there. They are present. They have already established their own reputations and their names. They can be a part of the rebuilding process in a way that they might not have been had this not befallen the Republican Party. That may be just wishful thinking, but I thought it was a really interesting argument, and it sounded like it might provide a really interesting future.
And interesting that it's women that you pointed out, because the things that the Republicans say they need to get are more women, more minorities, and there is that other generation, Nikki Haley's of the world, that are waiting there, right?
Yeah. And I think, if I might digress a little bit, one of the most interesting things I heard at the Republican National Convention in Cleveland was in Ivanka Trump's speech, where she said, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat, or I'm paraphrasing, but she dissociated herself from the establishment of both parties and identified herself as a millennial. And I think that was a really insightful comment on her part about where the future of the Republican Party lies. It does not lie in the kind of hyper-partisanship that has characterized their past. It lies in a different future that is going to be determined by people like Ivanka Trump and other millennials. And I thought that was really hitting the nail on the head, very prescient.
And the millennials, of course, are a huge voting bloc now and will be going ahead.
Getting bigger and bigger all the time, right? Like they don't just arrive and vote, they keep arriving and arriving and arriving.
And the baby boomers keep leaving the seat.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, one of the most fascinating things about the time we're living in, is we have this huge handover of a big demographic like the baby boom, to the biggest demographic we've seen in the time of the baby boom, which is the millennials.
Yeah.
And their values are different, their political interests are different, what they want for the future is different, and they're going to make a difference. It's going to be their way. For the first time, it's not going to be my way.
But that's okay, because you're doing a good job of observing their way. Our millennial interpreter, Keith Boag. We're going to go back to Hillary now. Frank Wright would just like to know in general, what is your opinion on Hillary's email scandal?
Look, there's no doubt it was an error in judgment. There's no doubt that she has not been truthful about it. But there's great doubt about the damage that's been caused by it. When Donald Trump and his people called her Crooked Hillary because of that, I think they'd have a tough time making that case stick. I think that when you compare the two campaigns, one of the hard things about the email scandal is that it is such a complicated thing to drill down into. And, I have listened to people talk about it, I've read people write about it, and it's nightmarishly complicated to get down to what was really wrong there. Other than she shouldn't have done it, and she should have told the truth about the things that she said publicly that no longer square with what we know to be true.
Here's another Hillary question. It comes from Linda Rostevsky. She says, Hillary Clinton is overly scrutinized and has faced so much undue sexism. Would this dialogue continue if she becomes president? And this is what's interesting, because I read something about the first female president or prime minister of Australia saying that a lot of the misogyny came to the surface after she was elected.
Yeah.
So if we do have a President Clinton, what do you anticipate will happen in that end of things?
Well, having gambled wrong on the post-racial presidency of Barack Obama, I hesitate to say that we will be in a new era of the recognition of women's equality in the White House, because we're just always surprised about those kinds of things. One would hope that we would, but what can you say about Hillary Clinton? I mean, whether you like her or you hate her, she's been through a lot, and she stands up. I mean, she is tough. She takes it on. And I'm saying that because I think the first woman president is probably going to have a lot of difficult times and has to be, it has to be even-tempered about how to handle it. It has to be tough enough to take that. And, I mean, I don't think it's biased to say that, look at the things that she's been through, from having to deal with her husband when she was the first lady, to running in a Senate campaign and being a senator. Yeah.
And we are
to being in two really grueling campaigns for the presidency.
And you're seeing some of that misogynistic backlash in the things that are around the Trump campaign, in the buttons and the shirts and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I don't know that that's mainstream, but it's there.
I mean, we saw this at the Republican National Convention in Cleveland, where there were buttons. I mean, some of them are just, I don't need to repeat them, but they had no bearing on anything to do with being the president of the United States, a public policy position, her record, nothing. It was just the most vile, personal attacks on her. Mm-hmm. And I'm not even talking about lock her up or put her, things about how she looks and,
I don't think you'd see that for a guy.
Well,
there was no Ted Cruz buttons with that same kind of, anger.
There's a great thing in the Washington Post. Can I just mention this today, because it's so funny. It keys off the line that Donald Trump said in the last few days about how she doesn't look presidential. And it went through every single president of the United States ever with a funny little description of how she could look a little bit more like Abraham Lincoln, or and none of them was an oil painting. Let's face it. Some were literally oil paintings, but you get my point. Like, there's no such thing as looking like a president, right? I mean,
and the smiling more, all of that kind of thing.
You make it what you are, but no one else. I mean, what a thing to say. Like, what does that mean? Does Donald Trump look like a president?
We're getting a lot of Hillary questions, actually, which is fascinating, because we started this discussion on Donald Trump. Here's another question who wants to know if it's that insider idea of Hillary Clinton, that she has been inside the political scene for so long. Well, is that hurting Hillary? And that is coming from Howard Mackey Geldhart.
Howard, yes, absolutely. I think it has hurt Hillary since the beginning of the campaign, which would be last summer, that she was an insider. I mean, Senator Bernie Sanders used that against her in many different ways, that she was owned by, a political elite in Wall Street, that she had a super PAC, that she, even though he'd been a senator since the year dot, he was the outsider and she was the insider. I think in an election campaign where clearly so much of the support for Donald Trump is coming from people who feel that they've had enough with inside the Beltway politics, and they want somebody who is so completely outside the Beltway that they're willing to put up with all of his failings and weaknesses on understanding of policy. In some ways, you might even say that has helped Donald Trump. The less he knows about Washington, the more they think he's genuinely an outsider. I think that will be a large part of the way the campaign plays out over the next 9 weeks, that there will be a heavy emphasis on the part of the opponents of Hillary Clinton, and especially Donald Trump. Haven't you had enough of this yet, kind of thing? Because Hillary is not just of Washington. Most of her adult life has been wrapped up in politics and public policy and fundraising and all of the things that make the machinery of politics turn. And she happens to be running for president at a time when a lot of people are fed up with that, distrustful of it, and think it's actually hurting America.
So here's what Chris Montgomery wants to know about that. He's saying if Hillary Clinton does win, and she has been, even part of the Obama administration as Secretary of State, what will the biggest differences be between a Hillary Clinton presidency and the Obama administration?
Well, I think that it's going to be impossible for Hillary Clinton to entirely separate herself from the Obama administration. I think there are some traditional ways in which she will be different. I think most people point to foreign policy where she's more hawkish than Barack Obama has been. And, those are obviously important areas that could have huge implications for the world. And, Canadians in particular might be interested in that. But I go back to what happened to Hillary Clinton in the primary campaign, and there was a lesson for her to learn from her about her own party. She did not expect, none of us expected, maybe Bernie Sanders did, but that groundswell of support against the Democratic Party establishment is something that she cannot ignore. She wants them to turn out and vote for her in November, and she needs them to do that. But part of that bargain is going to be that she has paid attention to their concerns about, the influence of Wall Street, about things like student loans.
Incredibly progressive education policy.
Yeah, all of those things, if she ignores those, I think that would be very damaging to her thoughts about a second term. But I think another way of looking at that is that what Donald Trump has done is unite Democrats against him because of some of the racial politics of his campaign. By uniting them against him, it has allowed them to overlook some of the things that are dividing the Democratic Party that they don't like about Hillary Clinton. But that's a temporary reprieve. And, she's a smart woman, but you better not forget that.
This is going to be our final question, and it comes again from Linda Rostevsky. She wants to know, will a Clinton presidency mean a better relationship between Canada and the U.S., especially with respect to the economy? And then once we get your thoughts on that, let's get you to look forward to the possibility of a Trump presidency and what that could mean with relationship to Canada.
Remind me of that stuff
I
as we
will
go
remind
along.
you.
Let me see, whether you mean a better relationship than we've had with Barack Obama. I think that
it depends if you're talking Harper or Trudeau, right?
I guess it depends on all of those things.
Yeah.
But let's not make it more complicated.
Yeah.
Let's not let me make it more complicated than it needs to be. These things, I think, are determined very much about the ad hoc issues that happen between us. I don't think that you would find that there were terrific ideological differences between Democrats and liberals on a range of issues. What we do see is this anxiety in the United States, in the Bernie Sanders supporters and the Donald Trump supporters, which are very grassroots, about our about the U.S. trading relationships with other partners. Whether that has real consequences for TPP, we're going to see, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But, there's also talk about NAFTA. Mm-hmm. There's a whole sense that somehow America is getting the short end of the stick in its international relationships, particularly on trade. We can't forget that we are America's largest trading partner, and that, any kind of increased sense of protectionism. And these things can easily be exploited by Congress, and we've seen that over and over again. Mm-hmm. When there is that kind of sensitivity, I think people have to pay more attention to the bilateral relationship.
And that could happen regardless of a Clinton presidency, because some of those progressive Bernie Sanders supporters of hers that trade's a big issue for them too, right? So even though Trump has been louder on trade, in either way, I bet there are folks in Ottawa who are really wondering, come November, how trade may change.
And I think that, to get back to a point that we were making earlier, the thing to really pay attention to is not just whether it's Trump or whether it's Clinton or how their administration works, but how the demographics of America are changing and what that means to Canada. And again, we're talking about the rise of the biggest generation since the baby boom, the Millennials. Their values are different. Their politics are going to be different. Mm-hmm. How they exercise their political influence is going to be different. And I think that, that's a long and evolving story, but it's not too early for Canadians to pay attention to that and see whether those same things are happening in Canada, and whether they are or whether they aren't, what is the impact of them happening in the United States on Canada.
So certainly so much to be watching for as we head into the final weeks of the campaign. Thank you, Keith, for answering. And thank you for sending in your questions. We hope to do this again sometime soon. Goodbye from the Washington Bureau of the CBC.